Volume 3 Chapter 20. They're not ready. But how could they be? Shaziryu asked, his mouth falling open and giving a somewhat sheepish sort of laugh as he looked up at the masked caster and down into the bright red eyes of his bodyguard. Then bring us in. Ainz replied with as much dignity as he could muster. I've gotten at least a little bit better about public appearances, but still, unless I treat this as a guild meeting I'm mostly lost. I should watch more of how Queen Draudillan acts under pressure. After all, who could be in greater difficulty than her? By the time he reached the crude little wooden gate, Ainz had managed to set aside his fears and focus on the matter at hand. Meanwhile his heart still pounded in his breast. He noted that the lizardman had sharp eyes, sharp teeth. It was like being surrounded by little monsters. Keep calm, Ainz. Keep calm. You should have known your humanity would assert itself now and that being surrounded would do this. He made another mental note to himself. After this is all over, I'm going to have to expose myself to more non-humans and people outside of Nazarick. All this power, I've even killed summons and undead, but being this close to a bunch of easily killable lizard people makes my skin crawl? That's not okay. It almost felt like bigotry, even though he didn't feel any hatred for them. There was an almost reflexive discomfort, like being surrounded by a large number of beasts of uncertain temperament. He slowed his heart and slowed the rest of his body, cursing the sudden irrational reaction as absurd. He spread out his hands, holding his staff vertical to the ground to give himself space. The lizardmen backed away, their women, children, elderly, responding to his gesture, and Shaltir fell in at his left side as Shaziryu put himself at the head of the body of demi-humans. The way he moves. I have heard a king is like a great chief. Is this a king? Am I seeing what it is to be a king? Shaziryu wondered and reflexively began to kneel as Ainz spoke. Why are they kneeling? I just wanted some personal space. He wondered as he addressed them. I am Ainz Ulgaun, Lord of the Kingdom of Nazarick. On my journey I discovered your chief. He held out his gloved hand toward Shaziryu, badly wounded, and restored him to life. He has asked me, ruler, to help his people, even offering to trade himself to me in exchange for help for you all. A rumbling of awe spread among the tribes. The Red-Eye tribe looked at one another and at the chief of their rival tribe. He offered to sacrifice himself for us. We're not his tribe. Why would he do that? The thought occurred to many among their ranks. Still, their appreciative eyes were filled with gratitude for their neighbor, and Shaziryu's standing rose. Is there seriously something wrong with this world's taste? That felt so cheesy. Ainz asked himself as he made his grandiose gesture and statements. So for the sake of a chief who will trade himself away to protect his own, I accept his offer of submission and will extend my protection to all who call him their leader. Zariasu led the tribes away, a small band of lizardmen following behind in order to act as a rear guard and to assist their more distant razor-tail neighbor. Riding on Rorora with Crush Lulu, if it were not for the line of lizardmen and their families behind them. This might feel like an afternoon away with my mate, he thought, and raised a hand slightly to where Crush could see it. He curled his fingers forward a little, and the pale lizard woman leaned forward. After we win, after we've survived. Let's do this together. Go riding out around the Great Lake. Maybe further. You were a traveler before all this, weren't you? I've never traveled anywhere really. This is the farthest away from home that I've ever been. Crush replied, her bone-white face looking far away. I've always wondered how big the world really is. Is it really round like they say? How long would it take to go beyond it? If I hadn't been born this way, I might have become a traveler and found out by now. Crush didn't seem like she was really talking to him, more around him. But Zariasu answered her anyway by asking, why couldn't you travel? Because I am an albino lizard woman. We're born with powerful magic. That means I always had to stay with my tribe to help it, and then when I had to lead it, any thoughts of travel had to be put aside. Crush replied to him with a wistful voice. I can understand that, but it's a shame. Yes, the world is round. I once traveled among the dwarves. They took me up on top of a high mountain. Not for long, it was far too cold for me, but for a brief glorious few minutes I felt like I was standing on top of the world. And I saw the distant curve. It really is round. Zariasu snorted at that. I barely believed it myself. What an amazing thing. How big it must be, Crush said with awe. All right, then it's a bargain. We go back, we save our people, and everyone else who fights with us. Then I'll travel with you, Just once at least, one time to see something other than the same walls and waters. Really, you would really go with me? Zariasu asked, his hands tight around the reins of Rororo. Of course. One time at least. I wouldn't risk myself if I were alone, but if my husband, the bearer of frost pain, is with me, I think we will be just fine. Despite himself, that made Zariasu happy for the rest of the day's journey. That night, they made camp, hiding beyond the tree line, well away from the water they preferred in order to minimize a frogman threat. They made no fires. Instead they huddled together for comfort, with some of their numbers keeping watch while others slept. However, neither Zariasu Sasha nor Crush Lulu had any interest in sleeping, not really. Though each made the attempt, it was too much. Zariasu felt his blood run hotter than a lizard man's had any right to, and so after hours in the dark, he rose from where he lay. The buzzing and chirping of insects in the swampy woods was no stranger to him. It was a comfort, if anything. Amidst the chirping and howling of creatures in the night, he moved through shadows to the place where Crush Lulu lay stretched out. Her red eyes were sharp and they pierced him like knives. We can't win, can we? She asked him, and his scales brushed smoothly over her own, his body pressed close enough that she could hear his every breath. The way he held her, he didn't need to answer and she didn't need him to either. She moved aside her loincloth, and he moved aside his own. Her fingers dug into his shoulders, his tail moved to entwine with hers, then she rested her head in the crook of his shoulder. A moment later he was inside her. The ground beneath was cool, moist and squelched a little between the rustling noises of their slowly rocking bodies. Nobody seemed to know of the coupling that was taking place between the pair behind bushes covered by the shadow of a canopy that might as well have been as old as time. If they had noticed, at that moment neither Zariasu nor Crush would have given a damn. His hardened hands held tight against her slender frame while her tail clenched to him as if afraid he might slip away if she let go. She kept her little gasps and moans quiet, giving the noises of her pleasure only to her lover, savoring the intimacy of the damned, and savoring one last burst of life before they were sure it would all come to an end. It was not until hours of mating passed that either one of the pair was able to sleep, and neither slept at all, until they both did. When they slept, neither frogmen, nor dreams, nor nightmares of the same, troubled them at all. Volume 3 Chapter 21. Zariasu woke up at an hour when the sun had still not graced the world. The beams of light that would kiss the ground had not made their appearance. However, even if they had, beneath the thick canopy of the trees on the grassy and weedy bit of ground where he lay still entwined with Crush Lulu, no light could ever hope to pierce through much. The long night of love-making, scale to scale and tail to tail, had done nothing to rob the young lizard man of his vigor or his zeal to protect his people, and upon awakening he rose with energy surging through his body, as if he could take on the world if it threatened his people, and somehow win. Despite this, he did his best to disengage himself from his lover with care, moving as slowly as a thief in the night, his motions barely disturbing the sea of green and brown that surrounded him in the shadows of twilight's twilight. The light of the false dawn would begin before long, but his day had begun before that of the eternal sun. He went to check the guards and found them where they should be. The powerful warriors over whom he had been made chief clearly took their duties seriously. That was a relief at least. He felt the racing blood begin to slow in his body and calm overcame him. Zariasu went to each one in turn, slapping them on their shoulders and saying, "Thank you for watching over us," or some variation thereof. They grunted, seemingly indifferent, but in their eyes he could see they were pleased to have their service appreciated. The smell of the dew on the ground grew rich and the sounds of the day began with the cries of birds. The breeze picked up and blew over his body, wrapping around him like a familiar warm blanket while insects lit on his body and dreamed of being able to penetrate his thick scales. It didn't take long to make the rounds, but he had barely finished when the alarm went up. Lizardmen shouted their warnings and those who were awake shot to their feet immediately. Others sprang up from deep slumbers almost as fast as those who were already awake. Crush Lulu somehow knew exactly where he was and rushed to his side. A clutch of warriors formed up at either side of him, their spears and clubs made ready for battle when he raised Frost Pain above his head like a beacon. The tendrils of daylight that finally peeked over the far horizon struck the icy blue of his jagged magic weapon and made it shine like a star fallen to the world. The shadows that had caused the alarm slowly became more than shadowy blurs, and when they could be seen more clearly they one and all relaxed. "Lizardman," somebody said. Crush Lulu sighed with relief, All these warriors, and they instinctively rally to where Zariasu stands. He almost seemed to take it as a given that they would be there, and that he would be at the center, his tail relaxed and at ease, his fist tightly closed around the hilt of his weapon. The announcement that it was their own race was a relief. The barrier of tribalism meant nothing compared to the threat of annihilation, and so they waited and waved. When they drew close enough, Zariasu felt a sigh of relief come over him. Razor Tail. The center figure in the advance could be none other than Kyukuzuzu, bearer of the white dragon bone armor. Zariasu reflexively took the lead and approached the fast-moving band. The sound of their feet at a steady jog was finally audible, a low rumble as they made their way along the long shore path which dimmed as the group came closer and finally stopped. The white-armored Kyukuzuzu broke from the group and approached after his tribe stopped. They raised their hands shoulders height away from their weapons. Kyukuzuzu greets you. He had a crude voice, a simple and dull one that pains Zariasu for him. The curse of the white bone armor had robbed a genius of his mind and given him vastly greater defensive power. Zariasu Sasha greets you also. Zariasu answered. Razor Tail joined Small Fang, Green Claw, Red Eye, and Dragon Tusk? That was the key question to ask of the simple-minded chief. Kyukuzuzu inclined his head. Tribes say this for good. He smacked his heavily armored chest. Kyuku protects. Zariasu smacked his own chest in the same way. Zariasu protects, he replied. The armor covered most of Kyuku's body, but his face was still visible, and the tribal chieftain's eyes sharpened for a moment. Kyuku will fight with you. The chief replied with agonizing slowness, as if he were trying to swim through water to break through the surface of his mind and speak with some intelligence, enough at least to let him affirm their bond. How did you follow so fast? Zariasu asked. They shouldn't have come this far, not with their old to watch out for. No old left, we run, Kyuku said with glistening eyes, like a simpleton whose only pet had just died. I am sorry, Zariasu said and made a horrified mental note to ask what happened later. The tearful look in the simpleton's eyes told him the chief understood that whatever happened meant that the old would be gone forever, but asking why would be salt on an open wound. I can find out from the others, we needn't know just now. He told himself and he waved his hand behind him. We move together back to the Green Claw village. There we fight, go take prisoners, learn how frogmen come for us with many. Zariasu explained, and again his simple terms reached through the simple mind to be understood. Kyuku raised his empty hand again and gestured toward the waiting allies, and the Razor Tail added their numbers to the band. The journey back to the Green Claw village was with the armored Razor Tail falling in with the rest. A few scouts kept back in front to keep an eye out for any potential trouble. As a precaution they kept away from the lake to avoid any potential ambush, and the sunrise of morning passed into the steady slog of midday, and then finally became evening again. Zariasu made love to Crush again that night, and again they fell asleep in each other's arms, and the routine began again before the sun arose on the day after. Finally the Green Claw village came into view, a little dot at first. Zariasu felt relief flood through him, relief that became a sudden panic when he heard shouting louder than any he had ever heard in all the years of his life before. Danger. The village is in danger. It was an immediate sense of panic that hit the lizard man and he very nearly ordered an attack before he felt the hand of Crush Lulu on his arm. Wait. Listen, she whispered to him, and he listened more closely to the shouting in the village, and looked more closely as well. There was no indication of fire, though it meant very little to him since frogmen seemed to have a deep and abiding hatred for fire in general. The shouts were gleeful, they were cheering? Why are they cheering? Zariasu wondered. Answer or no answer, cheering was a relief. So they rode on, slow, steady, and finally came close enough to the gate to realize that nobody was watching outside the walls. All eyes were centered within. Someone finally sensed the approaching mass and shouted to alert those within. Gesturing wildly, the lizard man youth had his hands waving frantically, a spear thrusting over and over up toward the sky. He all but danced, tail and body alike. Zariasu looked at the youth as if he'd gone utterly mad, but nonetheless he led the tribes toward the wide gate and into the interior. Ahead he saw a tall figure that stood like a human, his back straight and eyes forward speaking with some of the elders. The figure wore a rich dark cloth which even at a glance he knew would have been worth a fortune in a human marketplace. At the robed man's side however was something that immediately caused his eyes to lock on and every fiber of his body screaming danger. The lance-bearing knight was half the size of the tall figure, and yet with scarlet armor covering their body, it was obvious that danger lay, the promise of unbeatable violence, waiting to be unleashed. "We are damned or saved, by what I am seeing now," he whispered in a hushed voice so low he doubted himself that he even said what he did. He retained his doubt until his brother approached and embraced him so tightly that the claws of his fingers dug like knives into Zariasu's body. To the uncertainty he had but moments before expressed, he now had his answer just as quickly. Volume 3 Chapter 22. Ines felt the increasing number of eyes at his back and slowly raised a hand in front of his chest to stop the elder questioning him and looked over his shoulder. "Telling one lizardman from another isn't easy yet, but I would definitely remember that weapon. And that albino lizard woman, and that armor. New arrivals. Shaziriu's brother must have been successful." Shaziriu rushed past Ines and flung his arms around the one bearing the oddly shaped blue blade. "Definitely a brother," Ines thought as he watched them embrace in relief. Shiltir looked up to her lord and whispered, "Lord Ines, isn't it disrespectful to not pay mind to you right now?" Ines set a comforting hand on the red-armored shoulder of his subordinate. "No, not right now," he said. "He has to brief the newcomers so they—" His tongue defied him briefly as he sought what to say next. "Know who is in charge? Know who I am?" For the former office worker it was still too uncomfortable to say he was in charge of so many unknowns, and so he said, "Know who I am." It was ambiguous enough that Shiltir accepted it and waited patiently at his side while Shaziriu explained. Zariasu shook his head in disbelief. "You must be joking. You raided the frogmen yourself." "I did, and only survived because of them," Shaziriu said and gestured toward the king of Nazarick with one open-scaled hand as Ines turned fully around to face them. When the caster faced him, Shaziriu went down and bent his knee in submission. Zariasu quickly followed, bowing his head. "You saved my brother's life. As he goes, I go also. I ask only one thing." He held his breath, a more charismatic figure he could scarcely imagine. The figure before him seemed as godlike as the small red-armored knight seemed dangerous, and yet they had never traded words, so he was almost fearful of what answer he might receive. "What is it you ask for?" Ines asked, tapping his staff on the soft soil of the village. "That after you secure our safety, that you secure our prosperity. I want the lizardman to grow strong," Zariasu Shasha said, making a point to ask it for all the living tribes of his people and not only for the one which was now his. Crush Lulu descended from Rororo and joined her lover's side, descending to one knee on her own. With three chiefs down on one knee, it became a cascade effect which radiated to the entire assembled body. Shiltir wore a bright and contented smile. At least they're sensible enough. She offered her highest praise to the beings that were unworthy even to serve as paving stones for her master. "I accept your fealty and your request. But we need to know more than we do. Was the captive successfully retrieved?" Ines asked, and a lizard man raised his head. "Yes, my lord. I will retrieve it." The lizard man sprang to his feet and rushed into a small hut. There was a cacophony of shouting and a brief struggle before at last the lizard man returned. He had a rope wrapped entirely around the body of the frogman. Its arms and legs were bound together and secured in a tangle of different knots. Its head and throat were visible, but the rest was essentially dressed in rope as near as Ines could think to call it, and the lizardman dragged it down the short steps where the bruised and battered creature thudded and grunted in pain before being dragged through the dirt and muck. "We have questioned it, and questioned it hard, my lord, but it has given us nothing. I'll give you a spear in the guts. I'll give you a crack to your skulls. I'll give you death. I'll give you pain. I'll give you slavery that works you till you die of exhaustion and the world forgets you ever lived. But I will never talk. I will never tell you anything no matter what you do to me." The frogman belched out his words. His slimy green skin may have been able to sweat, or not, but with its rounded head, bulging throat and the constant rumble from its ragged breaths it was hard to say much of anything about it. A little like Demiurge's alternate state, Ines considered as he looked at the creature. It was tough, that much was sure. Blood seeped through cracks in the rope, the limbs were contorted uncomfortably and in angles that couldn't have been natural for it. Broken limbs, bleeding body, but still it shouts defiance. He is strong. The tormenting of the creature made his stomach queasy to be sure, and yet he needed information. He crouched down so that his mask was hovering fully in the face of the frogman while around them the lizardman tribe stood up. "Are you sure you won't talk?" You won't tell us anything? Ainz asked. Never, outsider. But what you? You're no lizard man. The frogman's ribbity-like voice was coupled with huge eyes that widened as they darted back and forth from Ainz to Schultier. I am the king of Nazarick, and the new master of the lizardman tribes. He answered glibly, then thought, however that happened. He suppressed the snort and waited for the frogman to process that information. Then you're my enemy, and just as dead as the rest of them. The frogman struggled with desperation in his bonds. Agony twisted his face very briefly from the broken parts that were bound within ropes. Die. Just die. The great chief, our first queen, Hiketi, will come and kill you all. You're all dead and you deserve to be for barring our manifest destiny to rule all the Great Lake. Die. Just die. It howled so loudly against the bonds and quiet rumbling lizardman that Ainz might have thought it a wolfman rather than a frogman at that moment if he could not see the bulbous rounded head with its huge eyes at the upper edges of its head and its bulging throat. Nothing will change your mind? I can't bribe you with riches or comforts to talk? Ainz pressed the question home. No. I am absolutely loyal to my tribe and to my queen. The frogman belched out the words with a furious ribbiting noise that Ainz took to be frothing anger. I see, Ainz said, and then after standing up he put his hand on Schultier's shoulder again. She looked up at her master. Go on, question him. Ainz gave the order. She had a playful smile on her face that did nothing to hide her fangs as she pointed her hand down at him. Charm species. Hi there, friend, could you answer all my master's questions? Tell us everything you know, I'd really appreciate it, she said in her sweetest little girl voice. Of course, my dear friend, anything for you. The frogman said, and as one the lizardman village cried out. What?